On the morning of February 24, 1986, a quiet West Los Angeles townhouse became the center of a story that seemed simple, tragic, but simple. Police responded to a call about a possible break-in gone wrong. Inside, they found Sherri Rasmussen, a 29-year-old nurse, dead on the bedroom floor. There were signs of a struggle. There were signs of a burglary. There were signs, at least at first glance, that told a story everyone was ready to accept. It looked like a home invasion. And for more than 2 decades, that was the version of events that stood. Until the autopsy spoke. Sherri Rasmussen was newly married, recently moved, and in the middle of building a life she was excited about. She had married John Rutan, a charismatic electrical engineer, just 3 months earlier. Friends described Sherri as confident, practical, and warm, someone who moved through the world with purpose. The townhouse showed signs of normalcy: unpacked boxes, wedding gifts, everyday clutter. Nothing about the home suggested danger. Nothing suggested enemies. Which is why, when investigators arrived, the explanation that fit best, a random break-in, slid into place with alarming ease. Police observed that items were disturbed, drawers were open, a car had been moved. Sherri's body bore signs of violence. She had been beaten and shot. The initial assessment leaned toward robbery. That mattered, because once investigators decide why a crime happened, it shapes everything that follows: who is questioned, what evidence is prioritized, and which leads quietly wither. Sherri's husband, John, was questioned and eliminated as a suspect early. He had an alibi. He was cooperative. He fit the role of the grieving spouse too well to question for long. And so the case settled into a dangerous assumption. Someone broke in. Something went wrong. Sherri fought back and paid the price. The autopsy revealed brutal injuries, blunt force trauma, gunshot wounds, and most notably, a bite mark on Sherri's arm. At the time, bite mark evidence was controversial and often misunderstood. It didn't scream solution, it whispered maybe. Investigators collected samples, but without a suspect to compare them to, the evidence went dormant. That bite mark, the most intimate mark a killer can leave, would sit in storage for years, waiting. There was one uncomfortable detail that some investigators noticed and others waved away. Before Sherri married John, there had been another woman in his life, a serious one, a volatile one. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. She was a police officer with the Los Angeles Police Department, and she did not take the breakup well. Friends of Sherri later said she had been uneasy about Stephanie. There had been strange phone calls, uncomfortable run-ins, moments that felt too pointed to be coincidence. But here's the problem no one wanted to confront in 1986. Stephanie Lazarus was one of their own, a fellow officer, a trained detective, a woman who understood police procedure. The idea that she could be involved felt unthinkable and inconvenient. So investigators did what institutions often do when the truth threatens their own credibility. They looked away. A burglary narrative offered comfort. It meant the violence was random. It meant no one failed. It meant there was no betrayal to examine. And crucially, it meant the case could go cold without controversy. Leads dried up. Evidence was boxed. Time passed. Sherri Rasmussen became another unsolved homicide in Los Angeles, a tragic victim of bad luck, or so it seemed. Sherri's parents never accepted the burglary theory. They pointed out inconsistencies. They asked why valuables were left behind. They asked why the violence felt personal. They asked why no one took the jealous ex seriously. Their questions went largely unanswered for years. While the case sat dormant, Stephanie Lazarus built a career. She rose through the ranks. She married. She earned respect. She worked cases. She questioned suspects. She wore the same badge that once shielded her from scrutiny. And the bite mark, silent, patient, waited. Every cold case has one question scribbled somewhere in the margins. What if we were wrong? In Sherri Rasmussen's case, that question would eventually be answered by science that didn't exist when she died. And when it arrived, it would do something devastating. It would prove the break-in never happened. For more than a decade, Sherri Rasmussen's case sat in a filing cabinet marked by dust and resignation. To the Los Angeles Police Department, it was an unsolved homicide, tragic, unfortunate, but inactive. To Sherri's parents, it was something else entirely. It was unfinished, and they refused to let it stay buried. Sherri's parents, especially her father, Niels Rasmussen, reviewed every detail of the case obsessively. They noticed things investigators had dismissed early on. Expensive jewelry left behind, no forced entry consistent with a stranger panic, violence that felt personal, not opportunistic, and most glaring of all, the bite mark. To them, the bite mark wasn't a footnote, it was a signature, and they believed signatures belonged to people, not accidents. Even as the case went cold, one decision from 1986 quietly saved it. The biological evidence was preserved. Saliva collected from the bite mark was sealed, logged, and stored. At the time, it was nearly useless. DNA technology was still crude, and bite mark analysis was controversial. But preserved evidence has a dangerous quality. It ages better than lies. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, LAPD began revisiting old cases using emerging DNA technology. Sherri's case resurfaced not because police had an epiphany, but because her parents wouldn't stop asking uncomfortable questions. Eventually, the case was reassigned to detectives in the LAPD Cold Case Unit. They started from scratch. No assumptions, no sacred cows, no institutional blinders. And the first thing they did was challenge the burglary theory. Fresh eyes saw what others had rationalized away. If this had been a robbery, why leave valuables? Why stay long enough to engage in a brutal fight? Why bite the victim? Robberies were about speed. This crime was about emotion. As detectives reconstructed Sherri's life, one name surfaced repeatedly in interviews with friends and co-workers: Stephanie Lazarus. Not just as an ex-girlfriend of John Rueten's husband, but as a presence that lingered uncomfortably close. Witnesses recalled Stephanie confronting Sherri before the wedding, emotional outbursts, a fixation on John that bordered on obsession, and most disturbingly, she was a trained police officer. She knew how crime scenes were interpreted. She knew what evidence mattered and what could be explained away. Why hadn't Stephanie Lazarus been fully investigated in 1986? The answer sat at the intersection of power and discomfort. She wasn't just a suspect, she was LAPD. That didn't mean she was untouchable, but it meant scrutiny came with consequences. It meant questioning her meant questioning the department's own judgment. And for years, that question was avoided. By the early 2000s, DNA analysis had evolved dramatically. Cold case detectives revisited the bite mark evidence and realized something critical. Saliva from a bite mark could now yield a full DNA profile. The evidence that once whispered could now speak. But there was a catch. They needed a DNA sample to compare it to, and that meant quietly obtaining one from Stephanie Lazarus, without tipping her off. Detectives didn't rush. They watched, they waited, they gathered circumstantial evidence, rebuilding the case piece by piece while the bite mark sample sat in a lab queue. Time passed. Stephanie Lazarus continued working as a detective, investigating crimes, interviewing suspects, all while her own DNA sat in storage, one comparison away from exposing her. In 2009, the results came back. The DNA from the bite mark matched Stephanie Lazarus. Not partially, not inconclusively, exactly. The room reportedly went silent, because this wasn't just proof of guilt, it was proof of betrayal. A police detective had murdered a woman in a jealous rage and then spent decades enforcing the law. The implications were staggering. If the burglary theory had never been challenged, if the evidence hadn't been preserved, if Sherri's parents had stopped pushing, the truth would have died quietly. Instead, the lie collapsed at once. Detectives knew they couldn't arrest Lazarus immediately. They needed her to talk. They needed her to reveal what she believed no one else knew. So they called her in for what she thought was a routine interview. She walked into the station wearing confidence. She walked in believing she was untouchable. She was wrong. For more than 23 years, Stephanie Lazarus had lived on the right side of the interview table. She had questioned suspects. She had read body language. She had watched people unravel under pressure. Now, in 2009, she was being asked to sit down, and for the first time in her career, she didn't know what the detectives already knew. When Lazarus received the call to come in, nothing about it raised alarm. Cold cases were being reopened all over Los Angeles. She had been a patrol officer in the 1980s. Her name coming up felt inevitable and harmless. She arrived composed, professional, confident. She was still wearing the armor she had worn for decades, the belief that the badge protected her. The interrogation room was unremarkable. Plain walls, metal table, 2 chairs. No intimidation, no raised voices, just patience. The detectives didn't accuse her. They asked questions about 1986, about John Ruetten, about Sherri Rasmussen. Lazarus answered smoothly. She smiled at times. She spoke as if the story had been rehearsed long ago, because it had. She said she hadn't seen Sherri in years. She said she had moved on. She said the past was behind her. But her body told a different story. Her posture tightened, her jaw clenched, her voice sharpened when Sherri's name was mentioned. The detectives noticed, and they waited. After hours of calm questioning, one detective slid a single piece of paper across the table. No speech, no build-up, no drama, just 4 words. Your DNA matches. The room changed instantly. Lazarus froze, not confused, not surprised, cornered. Her breathing quickened. She laughed once, a short, brittle sound. Then she began to talk, fast, too fast. She claimed the bite must have been from a previous encounter. She had bitten Sherri during a consensual moment. The DNA didn't prove murder. The detectives didn't interrupt. They let her bury herself. Because one thing criminals often forget is this: when you try to explain evidence away, you admit it exists. A detective asked quietly, "If you hadn't seen Sherri in years, how did your saliva get on her arm the night she died?" Lazarus stared at the table. She had no answer. As the hours passed, her composure cracked. She leaned back, she crossed her arms, she smirked. And then, something chilling happened. She began to speak about Sherri with contempt, as if the victim were the problem, as if the murder were a consequence. The jealousy was no longer buried, it was visible. Lazarus never said the words, "I killed her." She didn't need to. She admitted. She went to the townhouse that morning. She confronted Sherri. There was a fight. She was there when Sherri died. Every admission narrowed the room. Every explanation contradicted her earlier denials. She was confessing in pieces, hoping fragments wouldn't add up. They did. When detectives stood and placed her under arrest, Lazarus didn't resist. She didn't cry. She looked annoyed, as if inconvenienced by accountability. She had believed for decades that time had erased her crime. DNA proved her wrong. True crime audiences often expect suspects to break down. Stephanie Lazarus didn't. She rationalized, she minimized, she blamed, which made the interview terrifying because it showed something worse than panic: entitlement. The arrest sent shockwaves through LAPD, a veteran detective exposed as a murderer. Questions followed. How did this go unnoticed for so long? Who failed to push harder? How much did institutional loyalty delay justice? There were no easy answers, only consequences. When Sherri Rasmussen's parents were told about the DNA match and the arrest, the relief was muted. They had known for years. What they felt wasn't vindication, it was exhaustion. Justice had taken too long. With the interrogation complete and DNA confirmed, prosecutors prepared for trial. Stephanie Lazarus, once a detective, was now a defendant. The woman who had worn the badge would finally face a jury, and the burglary myth would die in open court. For 25 years, Stephanie Lazarus had believed the story was finished. The break-in explanation had stuck. The case had gone cold. The department had moved on. And for more than 2 decades, she had lived a life built on the quiet confidence that no one would ever dare to look back hard enough. But in 2011, she sat at the defense table of a Los Angeles courtroom. No badge, no authority, no control, only evidence. The prosecution didn't need to convince the jury that a crime had occurred. That part was never in doubt. They needed to convince them of something far more unsettling, that the crime had been misunderstood on purpose, that a murder had been dressed up as a burglary because the truth was inconvenient, and that the person who benefited most from that lie was a police officer. The heart of the prosecution's case wasn't a witness, it wasn't a confession, it was the autopsy report. Medical examiners testified that Sherri Rasmussen's injuries were inconsistent with a random home invasion. The violence was excessive and personal. The struggle was prolonged. The bite mark was deliberate. This wasn't a robbery interrupted. It was a confrontation fueled by emotion, jealousy, rage. Jurors heard expert testimony explaining how saliva recovered from the bite mark had been preserved since 1986. They learned how advances in DNA testing finally made it possible to extract a full profile. And then they heard the words that mattered most. The DNA belonged to Stephanie Lazarus. Not circumstantial, not speculative, biological. There was no alternate explanation. Then came the interrogation video. The room went quiet as jurors watched a seasoned detective unravel in real time. They saw the confident posture, the dismissive tone, the rationalizations, the moment the DNA was revealed. They watched as Lazarus shifted from denial to explanation, never quite admitting guilt, but never escaping it either. For many jurors, this was the turning point, because guilt doesn't always sound like panic. Sometimes it sounds like justification. Lazarus's defense team argued that the DNA could have been transferred earlier, that the bite mark could have come from a prior encounter, that the murder weapon was never conclusively identified. But the jury didn't need perfection, they needed plausibility, and the defense offered none. After deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. No applause followed, no celebration, just a heavy stillness. Justice had finally arrived, but it arrived decades late. Sherri Rasmussen's parents were present. They had waited 25 years for this day. They did not cheer. They did not cry loudly. They sat quietly, holding hands, grieving a daughter they should have grown old watching. Their restraint said everything. LAPD faced a reckoning. A detective had committed murder. A department had failed to confront the obvious, and institutional loyalty delayed justice. No amount of policy reform could erase that truth. This case is not just about murder, it is about power protecting itself, evidence ignored because it was uncomfortable, a family forced to become investigators, and science correcting a lie time tried to preserve. The break-in never happened. The autopsy knew it all along. Would this case have been solved without DNA advancements? Did institutional loyalty delay justice more than lack of evidence? Should cold cases involving law enforcement be reviewed automatically? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story disturbed you, challenged assumptions, or exposed how power can hide the truth, like this video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. These stories matter because silence protects the wrong people. Before you leave, this story isn't over. The next case reveals a family that looked even more perfect and a secret that stayed hidden for decades. If you want the full truth, watch the next video on your screen now.